And welcome to Elders Climate Action National Call. My name is Jen Chandler, and tonight's call, if you need to ask questions, or we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the call, please put all of your questions for Dr. Coppess in the Q&A box. You can use the chat box for any questions for me as the tech person behind the scenes, or any comments, but any questions that you would like to ask Dr. Coppess, please put in the Q&A box. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marianne Krasny, and she's going to introduce tonight's call.
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Marianne Krasny, and I'm on the policy committee of Elders Climate Action. And it's really my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jonathan Coppess, who is on the faculty at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and director of the Gardner Agriculture Policy Program. And he's author of this book, The Fault Lines of Farm Policy, a Legislative and Political History of the Farm Bill. So he's really, really, really steeped in not just current farm policy, but historical farm policy. He has served, I'm just going to say, Dr. Coppess, your bibliography is very impressive, because I'm an academic at Cornell, but I don't know many academics who have had such important government positions before they were academics. So Dr. Coppess served as Chief Counsel and Special Counsel for the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. He was also the administrator, which I think means like the chief, the head of the Farm Service Agency at USDA. You can correct me if I'm wrong, and legislative assistant to Senator Ben Nelson. So Dr. Coppess grew up on his family's farm in Western Ohio. He went to school in Ohio, Miami University, where he got his bachelor's degree. And then he came to Washington and got his law degree from George Washington University Law School. So with that, Farm Bill is, I don't know that Elders Climate Action or the climate community is really the traditional stakeholder, but we'll learn a lot about the Farm Bill and maybe how we can play a role in the upcoming reauthorization. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Marianne. That was very nice. And it was a nice way to describe my sort of nefarious background and long and tortured journey through a variety of careers before landing here in Illinois. And so thank you to you and Jen and Mark and Francis and everybody for having me up to talk about the Farm Bill. As mentioned, if you have questions, and I'm going to just start with the screen sharing. We're going to talk Farm Bill. As Marianne kind of gave a bit of my background, just a little bit more of it. This is a picture of the farm back home in Western Ohio, and I served in the Senate and the Farm Service Agency as administrator for a couple of years in the first term of administration. And that was the head of the agency. It was quite an experience. So before we get to the Farm Bill, I just want to set aside a little bit of the state of the moment, if you will. Anyone may have seen it or heard it, paid attention to, or if you're really bored, you may even have read the bill itself. But Congress recently passed this summer the Inflation Reduction Act, and this was a just incredibly large bill that covered a whole lot of topics. We have sound problems again.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are having that issue again. It's sort of going, it's kind of cutting in and out.
Okay. Well, I apologize for that. And it must be something with the earbuds, so I'm just going to give up on it.
Maybe if you can cut down your volume, it might help.
Yeah, the volume's actually on our own end from our own computers, but I think maybe trying without the earbuds. We could hear you without the earbuds, so.
Can you hear me now? I think I turned them off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's better. All right.
Yeah.
Well, again, I apologize for
No problem.
For those technical difficulties. You think you get the right equipment, and next thing you know, something happens. So back to the Inflation Reduction Act. Passed by Congress under special rules. We won't bore you too much with that. You've probably seen some of the top line numbers. It amounts to, just to be, just to put this in perspective, it amounts to the single largest federal investment in climate change and climate change policy that we've ever seen. It also includes deficit reduction and a whole lot of other things. And just to give you kind of a sense that what we're going to talk about with the Farm Bill is within, some components are within that. Roughly $34.7 billion came out of the accounts of the agriculture, nutrition, and forestry around climate change. And you've seen some of these other items, the billions for clean vehicles and transportation fuels, investments in clean electricity and renewable energy, and on and on and on, paid for with some changes in tax law across the board. So this is important in its own right. But it also is important because it has or will have some impact on the Farm Bill. So I guess that leads us to the obvious question of the evening. And what is this Farm Bill? So as mentioned, I've got a law degree, and in law, we love our definitions. So let me give you an official kind of formal definition of the Farm Bill. It is multi-year omnibus authorizing legislation. So we typically write a Farm Bill for 5 years. That means most of the programs have a sunset date built into the statute, and those authorizations will sunset within usually 5 years. The last Farm Bill was in 2018, so we expect it to expire or need to be reauthorized next year in 2023. It's omnibus, and by that we mean it covers a lot of different topics, all within the jurisdiction of the committees that write it. In this case, the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee in the Senate, or the House Committee on Agriculture. But it is not a one-topic bill, like say an appropriations bill. This is omnibus, and then it's authorizing legislation. In general, we mean that it's going to authorize the executive branch to do something. It may authorize appropriations. With the Farm Bill, it's unique because it also has direct spending authority. So when it authorizes programs, these tend to be, some of these programs are entitlement programs, which means the recipients of those benefits are entitled to the spending, and it doesn't require appropriators to fight through the appropriations process every year. To give you a sense of the size of a Farm Bill, it can be roughly $1 trillion over 10 years. You can see here this breakdown. This chart was done by the Congressional Research Service, just reviewing the existing Farm Bill. And what is clear to everybody is that the largest item in the Farm Bill is for nutrition programs. And this is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, mostly the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the acronym SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. And this provides low-income Americans and families with direct cash benefits to purchase food. And then the other big titles, and the ones we're going to focus on the most, are crop insurance, conservation, and commodities. And then you can see a multitude of other programs and titles authorizing funding. And of course, there is both our authorizing nature and the omnibus nature of this bill. So the Farm Bill is sort of, because it's authorizing and it has mandatory spending, it gets caught up in the budget issues that we have in Congress. And so in order to actually understand the Farm Bill, how it's now written, and frankly, the political challenges, we got to talk about what's called budget baseline for a Farm Bill. So again, this is a chart that the Congressional Research Service has produced, and there's links at the bottom of the slide for those articles. I like this one because it gives you a really great perspective, again, of the main mandatory authorized spending titles in a Farm Bill: the nutrition and SNAP programs, crop insurance, farm commodity support programs, the sort of traditional subsidy programs, and conservation. And you can see that what CRS has put together here is a 25, roughly 26-year history of what we have spent in the Farm Bills, going back to 1990. You can see the trends and some of the changes, the incredible increase in SNAP spending, largely as a result of the economic recession in 2008, and some changes in the Farm Bill. You can see a little bit of the trend around commodity subsidy programs, the traditional subsidy programs, and the sort of switch off with crop insurance as we've moved more and more into this risk management model for farmers. And then from a climate change perspective, that bottom set of green bars is conservation program investments. And we can see a fairly steady, but moderate increase in the spending for those conservation programs. So that's what has been spent thus far in the last 25 years or so. But what we have to keep an eye on is what the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, in Congress, these are nonpartisan, non-affiliated, mostly economists who estimate various aspects of the economic indicators and issues. So for a farm bill, they will estimate things like crop prices and yields and production estimates, and they forecast this out over time. So what's critical is that under budget rules, we have this baseline. And the ag committees, when they write a farm bill, that's effectively the budget they have to work with. And under budget rules, if you spend above your baseline, you have to cut something somewhere else. So what this creates, and again, this is not, these are forecasts, and I think they do an incredible job at CBO to estimate this, but this is, their best educated forecast. This is not any basis in reality, but it becomes reality in the politics of a farm bill because that is the spending you have to work with. So when the committees come back in and it says, we expect roughly $6 billion a year in conservation programs over the next 10 years. If you want to increase spending on conservation programs, you're going to have to cut something else to offset that because you're not, the committee itself has to stay within this baseline projection. So this is a slight indication. We're going to we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, because this is one of the main indicators we'll watch for as Congress gets ready to negotiate or gets ready to authorize the farm bill. The last time CBO gave us a full baseline estimate was in May of this past May. And this is what they projected. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, again, occupying the bulk of the spending, up over $100 billion a year. The years, if we think about what the committees will work with, we expect that they will work with fiscal year 2023 through 2032, or possibly 24 to 2033, kind of depending on the time frame. So it's going to be next winter in early 2023 that the Congressional Budget Office will produce this estimate. And that's the budget they have to work with. That's going to be the driver of it. And it clearly impacts the way policies are written. It impacts the politics. And the simplest way I can explain this is if we think of this in terms of being a zero-sum effort, right? If I got to cut somebody else's program to increase my favorite program, when we think about the need to have a coalition in Congress to be able to count up the votes you need to get past the House and the Senate, it's that broad-based coalition really built around these four main areas of spending that is what helps a farm bill succeed in Congress. But it also challenges it because it means that these coalitional interests can be pitted against each other under this baseline. It can be zero sum. And so in a scenario where we wanted to increase farm subsidies, they would have to cut something else. And of course, if you were to do so and cut SNAP, that's going to create a massive amount of political challenges, same with conservation and so forth. And so this is going to be one of the big items we watch for and try to sort out. I'm going to go through a little bit more of these numbers just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. And the first one I'm going to concentrate on are the conservation programs. From a climate change perspective, these are probably the first level of programs that people think about, and certainly is where the Inflation Reduction Act focused. So again, I apologize for the acronyms. The EQIP program, for example, is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. The funds you see for EQIP are direct payments to farmers to adopt a practice on their farm. So let's say the farmer wants to put in cover crops. That farmer can get a payment to offset part of the cost. We call it a cost share program, to offset part of the cost of that practice on the farm. CSP is the Conservation Stewardship Program. There's two versions of it on here because the 2018 Farm Bill actually shifted that program out of how it had been written in 2014. So you see both of them there. This is actually a 5-year annual payment. So let's say the farmer comes in and signs up for CSP. They'll have a 5-year contract, and each year they'll get an annual payment from USDA. And their responsibility then is to increase or improve and maintain the conservation across their entire farm. So this is a direct payment type system that you have to have qualified by having achieved enough conservation on your farm to be eligible for the program. And then if you get the annual payments every year, you're doing more. The goal is to push innovation and push and help farmers adopt more conservation and improve those outcomes on the farm. So everything from soil erosion to maybe habitat and water quality issues. If you're out west, we're talking about irrigation challenges and water efficiency and things like that. The Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, is the biggest item in this conservation title. It's also the oldest. This is the traditional conservation program in which we rent acres out of production. So usually a 10-year, maybe a 15-year contract. Those fields are pulled out of production for that time, and the landowner is paid an annual payment to do so. On top of that, we have the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. This places a federal easement or state or a group easement on acres to put them in conservation use. So one of the most common ones here is a wetlands restoration easement. We'll pay to permanently have a property right on that farm to restore and maintain a wetland. Very popular with those who like to hunt ducks because it happens to also create duck habitat. And then the Regional Conservation Partnership Program that was created in the 2014 Farm Bill. It's kind of an indicator of some of the frustration with these siloed type programs where we have the different acronyms and their different baselines. And in 2014, Chairwoman Stabenow led an effort to say, let's look across all these programs. Let's try to design conservation outcomes on a regional basis and expand what we're doing a bit. And so that program has been in operation for the last 2 farm bills, and we'll see these acronyms again. And again, what we're thinking about in terms of the farm bills is this 2023 forward set of years and what we expect, what Congressional Budget Office estimate or forecast the spending. And so those baseline challenges fit in here as well. If you wanted to expand CRP, you'd have to cut something else within that provision. So I've mentioned multiple times the Inflation Reduction Act, and this is an attempt to illustrate it, but I want to be cautious that it's a little bit of an odd fit. So we have the baseline; those are funded on a mandatory and permanent basis, and then the Inflation Reduction Act provided a 4-year authorization or 4-year appropriation to some of those same programs, but it's a different mechanism of spending. So one way to look at it is we were adding what we call budget authority on top of the baseline, but it actually isn't increasing those programs under the way CBO will estimate it. And I apologize. I know that's probably a confusing sort of bit, but it's both what makes the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act so unique and important. But it also will complicate some of the legislative efforts as Congress sorts out these different programs. So again, this is not an exact, this chart is not an exact perspective on it, but it gives you a sense that what Congress did was add in another line of funding for a few years, and then these funds are available through 2031, and that then can be spent out by the agencies in the programs. And I'll have a little bit more on that in a minute. In addition to that, when I talk about the traditional subsidy programs, here's just again the baseline estimates for that from May. The biggest one, the price loss coverage program. This is kind of that traditional, if prices are below a fixed target price and their reference price in the statute, then we trigger a subsidy out to the farmer. The ARC, the ARC programs are revenue-based triggers, so prices and yields are part of that. This just gives you a sense of the different the different programs within it, including assistance to dairy farmers and some standing disaster assistance, mostly for livestock producers if they lose animals in, say, a winter storm. But this is what we would consider the Title I components of the baseline. And then another note back on the Inflation Reduction Act, again, because it is such a relatively unique and important component to the upcoming Farm Bill. Here again, I'm just trying to illustrate what has been provided in terms of funding by program, and which conservation programs received funding in this. The largest bit of funding going to EQIP and RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And then the other thing that's unique about the Inflation Reduction Act that will matter in a Farm Bill debate. Remember, I said these programs are written for 5 years, and they would all have expired in 2023. Because of the unique nature of the way this funding was provided in the Inflation Reduction Act, the conservation programs have been extended through 2031. And so in terms of sort of the politics and negotiating issues around the Farm Bill, conservation programs now have a longer, a longer life, if you will, in the bill, whereas the subsidy programs in Title I will, and many of the other like research funding and rural development funding and things like that will be scheduled to expire next year. I don't yet know how this will impact the debate and kind of how this will shape up in the congressional committees, but it does alter the dynamics. It puts conservation, frankly, in a sort of on a better footing, if you will, or a stronger kind of position, so that it sort of indicates the importance of the investment that Congress made and how it may again feature in those debates. So as Marianne said, pure academic fashion, I tried to write a book, or I wrote a book, whether it's any good or not, I'll leave to your opinion. But it's sort of also one of my driving interests here at U of I, and in this is when I came out of Congress and came to academia, I had all these questions in my head. Why are we doing this? Or where did that provision, why a target price in statute to trigger payments, which led me down this path to say, okay, let's look at the history of this and try to understand what has gone on in the past and how that influences or gets us to the point we're at today. So I've got a little bit of a brief historical review. For those of you that like the history, I'll note a couple, kind of trivia type facts. So if Congress reauthorizes the Farm Bill next year in 2023, it'll mark 90 years since the first direct intervention in the farm economy in this kind of direct assistance to farmers type basis. The first Farm Bill, as we categorize it, was the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. And of course, for those of you who pay attention to history, this is the Great Depression. This is the New Deal era of Franklin Roosevelt, and the efforts to combat the Depression and efforts to help agriculture and farmers directly through payments and efforts to control production and try to improve crop prices, all date to that 1933 act. Here is a scene of the kind of auctions and challenges when farmers were going bankrupt and losing their farms back in that Great Depression era. In fact, most of agriculture in this country had been in a depressed state for the better part of 10 to 12 years prior to the 1929 crash and what was the Great Depression. The agricultural economy had expanded drastically during World War I, and had then kind of collapsed when the post-war demand had fallen off, and all the export markets in Europe, for example, were highly damaged. So one of the ways I try to make sense of this sort of long history of farm bills is with this little graphic here. And I want to caution, because this is, if you're an economist type, you gotta note a couple things. Number one, the scale. This is from 300 million acres to 400 million acres. It is data reported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's total acres of cropland used to produce crops. And so we can see the pretty significant increase beginning here in 1910. So the significant increase around World War I, and a lot of that being wheat acres out in the Western Plains, where there was a big push to produce wheat to feed the war effort. And we can see that spiking even into the depressed era after the war and into the Great Depression. I think this is one of the lessons we've learned in history, is that farmers in an economic crisis will continue to expand acres, largely because each individual farmer is making decisions to try to maximize the return on their farm. And then collectively, we end up with a lot of other acres. From a conservation and climate standpoint, this is also very relevant because the Dust Bowl. And so a lot of those acres that we expanded into in the Western Plains, particularly the Southwestern Plains and places like the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles and Colorado and New Mexico, where high plains have been under, for millennia had been under grasses, and we plow that under for wheat. And what I think is kind of a trick of nature. We had great weather during the 20s and good production, and then it turned into drought, and the cyclical drought returned, and all that plowed ground, or a lot of that plowed ground, then was subject to wind erosion and the massive Dust Bowl. This is important in the policy space because it also helps originate conservation policy. So the 1935 and 1936 Act were the kind of the first attempts at conservation, although World War II kind of redirected some of the focus there. If we go back to this chart again and we look for our next peak, this is during the Korean War timeframe. And what's important about this is that coming out of World War II, agriculture underwent a technological revolution. Mechanization, modern farming techniques, particularly synthetic fertilizers and other synthetic chemical inputs, better hybrid seed technology. So we drastically increased acres again. We increased acres a significant amount again, and at the same time, we're boosting the productive capability on those acres. And so the more acres, the more we can produce per acre. We got into a massive surplus problem in the 50s and 60s, and then the policy sort of responds to that. You can see the efforts in decreasing those acres after 1956. Part of that was the soil bank of 1956. The next round of conservation type policy, where we started to pay farmers to pull acres out of production and put them in conservation usage. Some of that continues through the 60s. And then, of course, the next big moment is here in the early 1970s. We began another massive increase in acres, again to scale, about 330 million upwards to the max in 1981 of 383. So about a 50 million acre swing normally in these times. The 70s was driven largely by some changes in policy, including the switch from the New Deal type system to a direct payment system based on prices to encourage production. But it also came in the wake of the controversial grain deal with the Soviet Union at the time that cleaned out a lot of stores of surplus commodities that we had on hand in the federal system. And then this, of course, led to, for those of you, again, who like their trivia, led to the second great farm economic crisis in the 1980s, when many farmers went bankrupt and went under. This is Farm Aid from 1985, which the first Farm Aid concert was in Memorial Stadium on the campus of the University of Illinois. So there's a couple trivia points for those of you who like trivia. The other issue that's really important to this discussion around conservation and climate was not only we'd expanded acres, but we were expanding acres that had been taken out of production before that were likely, or that were not likely, that were highly erodible. And as those acres eroded again, and here's a picture of sort of the erosion off of fields from precipitation and rain events, they're now also carrying a lot of those synthetic materials like fertilizer and chemicals. And so it increased the set of challenges. Of course, again, for those of you that sort of follow the history here, the 70s was also the birth of the modern environmental movement. The burning Cuyahoga River and the oil spill off of Santa Barbara, the first Earth Day in 1970, and what may be one of the most incredible short runs of a legislative achievement. In the early 70s, we got the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, we got the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act in 1972, the Clean Air Act in 1970, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 in the Nixon administration. All of those coming in this great burst of legislative activity as this new environmental movement came on the scene and really demonstrated some political power. And of course, this matters because agriculture has expanded into this scenario, and the politics around that begin to push for major changes in federal agricultural policy. And the 1985 Farm Bill created the modern conservation title and programs, including the Conservation Reserve Program. It also attached what we call conservation compliance to farm subsidies. So a farmer receiving federal payments has to address highly erodible land, has to address erosion on that land, and cannot drain wetlands and farm on wetlands and still be eligible for payments. So 1985 is a big moment for conservation policies. It then led to 1990, and the 1990 Farm Bill included the first and only title that was directed at global climate change. And it set up an office at USDA to coordinate and work on and research climate change. And there's a lot of talk in the 1990 debate about using some of these conservation programs like CRP to help address climate change. Unfortunately, for climate change, that was the first and only time we had a climate change title in the Farm Bill. And just another sort of charting of history for the long run perspective beginning in 1933. These are the total direct payments reported by USDA. They've been adjusted for inflation to 2021 dollars. The red bars are the what we consider the subsidies, the direct payments based on economic issues and challenges. And then the green bars are based on conservation. So I just subtracted those out from the total. And the bottom line here is that while we've had many conservation issues, the long history of farm bills has been mostly dominated by the subsidy payments to farmers and not conservation, which is one of those things to talk about and think about, even as we've seen, again, these challenges around the Dust Bowl and erosion, our more current set of challenges around nutrient losses in the waterways and things like the Lake Erie, Western Lake Erie Basin, toxic algae issues. And then, of course, out west, one of the biggest issues with climate change, one of the things that kind of keeps me up at night is sort of how the production can continue in some of those places where irrigation is absolutely critical. So from the Colorado River Basin to the Ogallala Aquifer, where we drill in and pump water out and irrigate in the center pivot circles you see there in the bottom corner. So a lot of changes, but a history in which we have not prioritized conservation spending based on the payments made. So that takes us to the 2023 Farm Bill, which, as you can tell, my outlook is as foggy and precarious and uncertain as it can be. I'm not, looking at that whether we're going off a cliff or there's just a little path down. One of the things that makes it challenging to prognosticate or to sort of forecast what might happen in the Farm Bill is our recent past has been a little bit dicey. In 1996, we had a major reform in farm policy, largely what we call decoupling. So we stopped making payments based on what the farmer planted and shifted this subsidy system into something less distorting in the farmer's decision making. That was followed by an economic crisis and a farm economic crisis, low price scenario, relatively lower prices after the Asian financial crisis of 1997 crashed export markets, which was then followed by 2002, which was unique so far in the history of these budget limited focused farm bills, because the budget committees actually provided $74 billion in additional funding for that farm bill. As you can see on the screen, almost all of that additional funding was spent on subsidy programs, a little bit for conservation, including creating the Conservation Stewardship Program, or its precursor, the Conservation Security Program. So 2002, 2008, not a lot of changes in policy in 2008. We did have a series of issues around the World Trade Organization, a big dispute with Brazil over cotton subsidies that required cotton to be removed. At the same time, we've seen this RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard, really kind of drive a lot of demand for corn and now soybeans, and the effort to offset oil-based transportation fuels with something renewable and grown here in our field. So corn-based ethanol and the Renewable Fuel Standard really kind of shifted some of the politics around the commodity interests and drove a higher range of prices for farmers. But then we get into the really messy farm bills. So in 2014, and full disclosure, this was the bill I worked on with Chairwoman Stabenow. In 2014, it took us 3 years to write a farm bill. It was largely a result of changes in Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, as this sort of Tea Party movement, Republicans in the House came into power and demanded a bunch of spending cuts, and they went after the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. that was highly partisan, highly polarized, and extraordinarily damaging to the sort of political coalition that gets a farm bill through Congress. In fact, the House of Representatives voted down the farm bill in 2013. The summer of 2013, they rejected the farm bill and sent it back to the committee to have to start over. That's the first time the House of Representatives had voted down a farm bill since 1962. So it was a long stretch before that had happened again. And it was really built around this sort of partisan focus on cutting spending, and the biggest spending item is SNAP. And so that received the partisan spending focus. They eventually pulled it together. They got a bill through in 2014. And then one may have thought they would have learned the lesson that that's not the way to do a farm bill. Unfortunately, 2018 kind of doubled down on this partisan budget-based process in the House. Then Chairman Conaway from Texas really pushed for drastic cuts to the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, at the committee level, and broke the coalitional effort. Democrats didn't vote for it at the committee. They didn't vote for it on the floor. It was again defeated on the House floor. So the only time in history we've lost a farm bill twice in a row. This time it was held hostage by an even harder sort of right-wing concern around immigration issues. And so they voted it down at first to sort of make their point. Then they got their way on a vote on immigration issues, and then we passed the farm bill. And this bill wasn't done in conference until after the midterm elections in 2018, and the House of Representatives flipped to Democrats. And so that kind of changed some of the negotiating dynamics. Of course, the theme here is that these have gotten extraordinarily difficult like everything else, in our polarized and partisan environment. And usually farm bill problems begin with budget-based attacks that focus in on SNAP and split the coalition up. So for 2023, that's the first thing we're going to watch for. What happens in the midterms? Does the House flip, and do the leadership, is the focus of the new leadership on cutting spending, cutting programs? Does the Senate flip and have the same kind of focus? If so, it's really hard to see a farm bill getting done. For SNAP, I'm going to not spend too much time on this. I sort of have two basic arguments about SNAP, particularly when we're talking with farmers and farm interests. The first is that, it's the raw political calculation. You're not getting a bill through the House and the Senate that doesn't have SNAP. It's the big vote gathering aspect of it. But I also challenge that it's support to customers and consumers of food. So it is in an indirect way supporting farmers, and is helping those who are consuming food who are of low income. It's not an unemployment program. You can work a job, maybe you work two jobs and still can't afford to put food on the table. So I find it absolutely puzzling on many levels that we get into these fights over SNAP and we see these kind of partisan attacks on it. And again, it's the worst part of the debate if it happens, and it's the clearest sign that we're not likely to have an easy farm bill process. On top of that, we look at the baseline issues. Remember how we talked about, this is the fixed amount. If we look at that's available, if we look at just the subsidy programs, we see this sort of dynamic in which the smaller acreage crops are the biggest individual beneficiaries of the programs, which is an indicator, I think, of the political challenges of this baseline zero-sum game. If all we think about is, how much does something spend? Well, the largest acreage crops like corn and soybeans are going to cost more for every change in those programs, because they are paying out on sometimes 90-some million acres in the program, whereas peanuts and rice are much smaller, around 1 million acres. And what we've seen is this dynamic in which it allows negotiations to kind of really benefit the smallest group. And this, of course, translates into SNAP, because that's the largest set of beneficiaries, from anywhere from 35 to 40 million people. And this, I'm not trying to pick on any one crop or region or issue, but it's a reminder that this budget environment not only complicates writing the bill, but really does upend some political dynamics, and kind of is benefiting what we would think of as a smaller factional interest in a farm bill. And so that causes us concerns It's also a reminder of just the incredible set of challenges. And here again is just another way to break down those outlays by crops, the incredible political challenges in it. Now, I want to just run over a couple of things very quickly because these have been a unique set of years since the last Farm Bill. So not only did we reauthorize the bill in 2018, the previous administration, the Trump administration, USDA created 2 programs out of its own ability, its own flexibilities, the market facilitation program, and after the trade conflicts began with that administration. And you just look at the incredible spending outside of or on top of the Farm Bill through these kind of payment programs. And then, of course, the coronavirus pandemic and the COVID challenges, which also led to additional spending. Bottom line, we've seen a level of spending on farm payments that outside of a Farm Bill authorization with no real historical precedent to work with. So we look at the next Farm Bill. I don't need to tell anybody kind of what the big issues are facing us, from markets and conflicts, from China to Ukraine, the continued fallout from the pandemic, and of course our political turbulence from January 6th to whatever happens on November 8th or the days after. A lot of that challenge and turbulence finds its way into even policy debates like the Farm Bill, and of course climate change being a big issue. So I come back around to this Inflation Reduction Act again, the programs, the additional spending by Congress, and the focus of the spending, that these dollars are appropriated directly through those programs, but only for the types of conservation practices or enhancements that will help improve soil carbon, reduce losses, including greenhouse gas emissions from farming. So not only is this a historically unique investment in conservation, is unique investment in conservation focused directly on ways that farmers can both manage the risk of climate of disasters and losses because of climate change, so be more resilient, be more risk sort of resilient in the operation, as well as way farmers can contribute to addressing climate change by adopting practices like cover crops, like other practices that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or even pull down carbon dioxide and other emissions and capture it in the soil, which would have a benefit for soils over the long term. And then my final one is, if we want to be controversial, we want to throw out some food for thought about where we might find funding in these tough baseline scenarios for climate smart agriculture. Well, if we took all the programs that pay farmers directly on land that's in production, so this is not this conservation reserve program, there's not acres taken out of production. This is sort of a combined effort of payments, the revenue program, the price loss coverage program, environmental quality, CSP, and RCPP. Here is the total spending CBO forecast for that. By my count, that's quite a bit of money that we could invest over multiple years that could be redirected and refocused in a program designed to, again, deal with resiliency and sustainability at the farm level, but also invest in the ability of farmers to help contribute to climate change and reduce emissions. So the potential's out there. Whether the political will or not is another big question, and most of those will begin to be answered in a couple weeks with the midterm election results. So with that, I thank you for sitting through it, and I know we've got some time for questions. I may have gone a little bit long, Marianne and Mark and Jen. I'm sorry for that, but I welcome any questions anybody has.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a lot. There's a lot in there.
I'm sorry.
It's really complicated, isn't it?
I remember one time explaining to somebody, what's the Farm Bill? I said, well, it's about 1,000 pages of legislative text, $1 trillion in spending over about 12 to 15 titles. But other than that,
everything else is easy. Okay. So we do have some questions. Let me just bring them up. Well, I'm just going to ask one just off the bat, because ECA has been working a little bit on food waste. And I don't know if you've heard of the Farm Bill Law Enterprise, a bunch of law schools.
I have. Yes.
And they have put together a report on food waste, urging that it either be a new title, which subsequently people have told me would be really stupid to ask for, because you don't get new titles in the Farm Bill, or under miscellaneous, which you didn't talk about, but that's sort of where a lot of other things happen in the Farm Bill. So do you think food waste, there's potential for addressing food waste issues, which are also about, a climate issue?
I do think yes. I do think there is interest. Again, a lot's going to depend on the politics, and like you said, where the spending comes from to do something like that. So you'll have to reduce spending in some other program and title to be able to pay for, to be able to offset any increased cost to do so.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't discount even creating a new title for it. I mean, we have added and subtracted titles, like the climate change title in 1990. But I do think it's an important discussion. It's important to push that set of discussions and push members of Congress to be thinking innovatively and creatively around how we reduce food loss, which, one, it's just waste, and two, it is there would be a climate benefit to that. And I think, I think there's some members of Congress that have been really forward thinking on that, that will continue to probably push for it. Again, a lot's going to depend on kind of the makeup of the committees and the leadership positions around, what's going to be allowed to go through and what the priorities are.
Well, thank you. And I think Jen, we do have a sign-on letter. I think Jen's going to put the link in the chat about food waste. So individual sign-on letter. So I have a question about fish farming. Is fish farming included in the Farm Bill? And if so, where?
That's a great question. Aquaculture does get some benefits from, say, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It is not its own title, and there's occasionally in the miscellaneous title something that will address some aquaculture issues, but it's a pretty small issue that doesn't have like the subsidy programs or the direct assistance type crop insurance and some of those things. But there are conservation dollars that will go out to try to help deal with any environmental or natural resource concerns from it.
Fish farming. Okay, great. So there's a question, it's related to SNAP. I think we had a couple of questions on SNAP. So one question is, can we shift some spending from subsidies for crops that are used for animal feed and for fuel to crops that humans will eat, especially vegetables, legumes, and fruit? So I have a related question, and that is, when we hear talks about climate in the Farm Bill, it's usually about the conservation programs. And yet, as you noted, SNAP is 76%, and there are programs like Double Up Food Bucks that are incentives for eating fruits and vegetables, with the idea that they could replace some of the, especially beef, the high climate emitting commodity. So what do you think about opportunities for SNAP funding that would promote, we can also call it healthy eating?
So you're right. One of the innovations in recent farm bills has been this double up food bucks, or this incentive program now to. So if you go to a store or a farmer's market and you're a SNAP recipient, you purchase fresh vegetables, for example, because those are more expensive to buy. We double the SNAP benefit associated with that. So that, of course, lends itself to other ideas like, climate change, climate smart produced foods, and so forth. The challenge is, and this is where the real controversy kicks in around SNAP, is that what we're providing assistance to low income individuals and families to purchase food, and our entire food system, we have relatively inexpensive calories that are processed foods and things like that. And so it makes it very difficult to change that policy, because many of the people who support SNAP want to make sure that we're getting food and getting the ability to buy food. And so it's often a concern that those of us who have the finances and the financial wherewithal that have those capabilities can make those choices and spend more money on some of those food products. But if you're just struggling to make the rent and pay the bills and put food on the table and get the kids to school, that could be a lot tougher. So you want to be very careful that those are not punishing anybody, or removing benefits. So the double up concept helps because it increases the benefit in this sort of encouraging you to buy fruits and vegetables or fresh vegetables and those type of food products. I think there could very much be in a Congress that wanted to talk about this and wanted to get into this. There could be very much some innovation and creativity around that to think, okay, what else can we incentivize? How else can we help, particularly in an inflationary time frame like we're seeing, where the prices are going, where your prices are going up, and you're balancing some of those really tough decisions in the family budget. So there are opportunities. There's some precedent like the double up program where we can think about incentivizing but not taking away, and that's a tough step. And it also becomes more problematic if we're talking about cutting spending and cutting those programs.
Can it be addressed through the subsidy end of things? In other words, through this, payments to farmers?
So we do provide assistance to fruit and vegetable farmers. They have crop insurance policies, some of them. We have a horticulture title that isn't funded to the same level as the farm subsidy program. It would take a change in policy to redirect some of those funds out of the sort of cotton, rice, peanuts, corn, wheat, soybean sort of bulk commodity program farmers that receive them now. There's other little things in there like transition assistance out of the CRP program if the farm's going to go into a younger beginning farmer who's going to, like start a community supported agricultural vegetable farm, for example. So there are some provisions like that. I do know there's many groups or some groups talking about how to improve that. How do we think about food production, particularly around our rural communities and some of the areas if climate change continues to cause the drought we're seeing in the Southwest and cause the challenges in the Central Valley of California. Those are the biggest producers of our fresh vegetables, particularly in the wintertime, obviously. And so thinking about alternatives or helping, supplement transition in areas where those vegetables can be grown closer to the consumers. Big set of questions. The last farm bill included some assistance and work around urban agriculture, so helping urban farms to some degree, very small, but at least beginning. So there are ways to do it, and there have been trends in that direction. I mean, they're small in the big budgetary item perspective, but there's been a real push in recent years to expand that.
Okay, great. So we only have about 4 minutes left, but I'm going to give you 2 questions to answer in the last 4 minutes. And one sort of generally has to do with forestry and carbon sequestration and where does that play a role, or silviculture or whatever. And the second question, I'm paraphrasing. Oh no, here it is. No doubt there are numerous professional lobbyists active on this. What can we do, or how can we help?
So on the forestry side, there is a forestry title in the Farm Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act added spending to plant more trees and do to increase forestry efforts to help with climate change. So we've seen an investment there. Sorry, I didn't have that on the charts. So that is an area. There's also talk about how we can reincorporate some forest tree planting, shelter belts, windbreaks, and things like that across the landscape, and using some of the programs like the Conservation Reserve Program or others to do so. So I think there's interest in that. There's certainly opportunities to push that. As for lobbyists, there are a lot of interests that get involved in this Farm Bill, and they work very hard at it. Obviously, members of Congress also listen very closely to their constituents, and so while lobbyists have a voice and they certainly have direct lines in many offices, they still don't, if they're effective, they're bringing in constituents and they're working through that. And so there are always avenues to be heard. It is an open process. Those amendments, those debates that on the committee level at the floor, those are open processes, and there's chances for people to make changes, for members of Congress to make changes that their constituents are demanding. The only way that lobbyists dominate this is if nobody else is in the conversation. So I think the biggest question is, they can be allies, they can be helpful. There are lobbyists that work across all aspects of this bill, from conservation to climate to SNAP to the subsidies to crop insurance. And so, you know, they're very active, but they can be allies. And again, it's a key. Getting your voice heard is key in the debate.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you. That's a great place and a great message to end with. And I'm going to thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks for everybody on the call. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Cook for a minute because he has, I think, an announcement or two.
Yeah.
And then we will
Can everybody
close
hear
up
me?
for the night. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, again, thanks so much, Dr. Coppess. Hello. With the upcoming holidays, the Education Committee would like to let you know about our events for the remainder of the year. And I want to give a big shout out to Ariana Jenna, who has found amazing presenters at a time of year when this is particularly challenging. So thanks, Ariana. This is the last national call of the year, this particular time and format. We will start back in January 2023. What we'll have is a two-part series next month dealing with climate anxiety and grief. And those dates will be November 17th, or I'm sorry, 14th and 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern time, noon Pacific time. Part one is November 14th, as I said. It's hard, and it's called It's Hard Knowing, the Inner Work of Climate Action with Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray. And then later that week on November 17th, the second part will be Coping with Climate, Supporting Children, Youth, and Ourselves with Well-Being and Climate Justice Activist Sean Trainer. So registration on those events will be coming soon. And then the last thing for the year will be December 8th, when we'll have a special event with Chef Christopher Galarza, who will discuss cooking with induction and answer all your burning questions, no pun intended. That will be at 7 p.m. Eastern time, 4 p.m. Pacific, again on December 8th. And if there's nothing else, I think that concludes tonight's event. Thank you all for participating.